morning. Welcome to OpenFest 2024. I'm Aneta Piekut from Sheffield Methods Institute in the Faculty of Social Sciences. I'm really happy to chair this session because we have speakers from different faculties, disciplines, and I think all of us will also, like all of us, including me and you in the audience, will be discussing also how to cross the boundary between us, people working in research at the universities, in academia, and sharing knowledge outside that. So we have three speakers from the University of Sheffield, Charles Rouge from Civil and Structural Engineering, Rebecca Draisey-Collishaw and Esbjörn Wettermark from Music Department, Andy Tesseral from Sheffield Centre for Health and Related Research. And the session title is Extending the Boundaries of Openness Across the Disciplines. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I guess we'll be talking a lot also how we learn from each other within the university across disciplines and also from other people outside the university. So each speaker or his presentation will be for 20 minutes and we'll collate all the questions after that. So it will give us a lot of time for discussion and hopefully some questions could be asked to a few speakers because the themes might be similar. Let's move on to our speakers. For the second presentation from Music Department in the University of Sheffield, Rebecca Draisey-Collishaw and Esbjörn Wettermark. Just check. Yeah, so your presentation is just here, and you talk about open access for ethnographic, participatory, and creative practice methodology. So we're changing topic to something different. So the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Many thanks to Rick Campbell and Jenny Adams for their ongoing support navigating all the challenges that go along with designing research that is fair, so findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Today we'll be talking about open research in relation to ethnographic, participatory, and creative practice methodologies, drawing on examples from our current work with Access Folk.
Okay, and we're going to go back and forth a bit here, so it's okay. So Access Folk is a UKRI-funded Future Leaders Fellowship led by Professor Faye Heald in the Music Department. And the project, which runs from 2022 to 2027, has a small research team consisting of Faye, Rebecca, and myself, in addition to a project manager, communications officer. The project is governed by a board consisting of individuals and organizations with different stakes within the wider folk singing scene in England. And broadly speaking, our research is about the place of folk singing in contemporary England, and we explore how we as researchers, but more importantly, our partners as scene insiders, can facilitate greater levels of participation in folk singing activities. So over the first 2 years of the Access Folk project, we have worked with around 250 people in the folk scene, not including the almost 900 respondents to our in-depth survey of folk singers and folk song practices. Around 100 people have been more directly involved in producing our research outputs, some as named and paid contributors and others through editing, writing and commenting on draft reports and on other outputs on a volunteer basis. This approach has been key for us to make sure that the project is indeed with folk singing communities and not simply another study about folk singing, folk singers, or folk song. So in ethnomusicology, which for those of you who don't know, ethnomusicology is study of people making music more than study of music itself, translated like that. So in ethnomusicology and various forms of folk music research, recording and documenting performances have long been a key methodology. And issues of privacy, intellectual property rights, and critiques of Western-centric knowledge production practices mean that ethnomusicologists are often quite reluctant to make their data openly available. However, this reluctance can mean that creators and their communities lose access to the data and the knowledge they contributed. Given the challenges around data sharing, it may be not surprising that most discussions about open music research come from the perspective of quantitative, computational, and empirical musicology, While ethnomusicologists have proven willing to embrace open access publishing, there's a notable dearth of dialogue about fair and open research. So Alexander Jensenius notes that music scholarships, or we would argue any scholarship that centers around ethnographic observation, creative practices, and participatory approaches, involves specific challenges to the FAIR principles. These challenges relate to the multimedia and multimodal nature of the data, the privacy and data protection, and intellectual property rights. And to these challenges, we would like to add a fourth related to the participatory nature of our research, and that is the visibility outside of the university context. In the remainder of this presentation, we want to take a closer look on how each of these challenges maps onto the FAIR principles and some of the strategies we employed to make our research as open as possible. We'll do this for examples we've drawn from Ask a Friend and our current small projects initiatives. Did I change it? Yes. A key ambition for Access Folk is to develop new methodologies to support participatory approaches in ethnomusicology. One of these methods is Ask a Friend, which engages folk singers to interview friends, acquaintances, and family members who are not involved with folk singing or the folk scene about their views of folk singing in England. So in the autumn of 2022, we recruited 22 co-researchers across England, and over 3 months, they conducted 61 interviews, which is submitted to us together with a range of metadata information, including an initial analysis of the interview recording and personal reflections on how the interview had impacted their own perspectives on folk singing. As we received the material, we invited co-researchers to participate in coding and data analysis, as well as co-writing the final findings report, which you can see the report on the slide. This collaborative part of the process had to be handled very delicately, and material was vetted and anonymized before being part of the co-analysis. And in this process, we also had to reflect in more detail around how this material could best be deposited for the future. Simply uploading recordings or transcripts to the university's data repository order did not feel right, even with the consent forms signed by all involved. Rather, we decided to present a representative snapshot of the data collected in the form of the metadata and initial analysis included in the co-researchers' interview report forms. We also included the transcribed section of each interview, a word association and reflection exercise that was conducted in the same manner by all co-researchers. Finally, to contextualize the study, we brought together the resources and documents used to inform, recruit, and train the co-researchers and interviewees, as well as templates used to organize and analyze the data. This material was made available in order on a restricted Creative Commons license. The choices made in this process were informed by FAIR and open data principles, but highly pragmatic, balancing ethics, access, usefulness, and transparency. So the participatory nature of Ask a Friend stretches the key aims of the FAIR framework in music research as discussed by Jensenius. To ensure that the data is indeed findable in the FAIR sense outside of the academy, we have engaged with the folk singing communities through online and print media by co-writing outputs, as well as distributed copies of outputs to key organizations and individuals. For the time being, Access Folk's website offers a user-friendly way to access the material, and by linking directly to order, this pathway should remain functional after the end of our project. Through Creative Commons licensing, we have encouraged people to use material in their own work. We have supported community publications by reading and commenting on drafts, and posted hard copies for use in workshops run by community members across England. As such, we attempt to bridge the variety of people affected by the research beyond the university. So in the context of participatory research, we do need to be careful that a FAIR approach does not become an academic tick box exercise, but do take into account stakeholder groups more broadly. Go.
I'll just add that some of the print media that Esbjörn has mentioned is available on the desk up at the front where we've been sitting, so you can get a sense of the types of things that we've been distributing and the different formats that we've been using. In the current action research phase of our project, we're working with 12 partners across England. Each is running an initiative that they designed to address a particular access need that is relevant to their particular context. We're supporting through funding and data collection about their project. The goal being that we will develop a set of case studies and supporting tools that other organizers can use to design their own interventions in their own communities. This goal also means that we want to be able to share our data and research between our partners and across stakeholders in the folk scene more widely. I'm going to start with a recording of one of our project partners, Sarah Hines. She's teaching a workshop, her workshop participants a chorus of a song. Before I start though, I'll just request that you stop recording, and I'll explain the sources for ethnographic research and research that includes creative practices, repertoire, pedagogical approach, interactions with the natural world, the texture of voices, and the many contextual details that become obvious through video and audio documentation are inadequately represented through textual descriptions and transcriptions, as you've just witnessed with my description of what was actually in that video. Recordings and images too can provoke useful and engaging, or provide useful and engaging models for our other partners and stakeholders. But the details that make photographs, audio, and video data valuable are incredibly problematic to deal with when it comes to making our data accessible, interoperable, and reusable. In this case, Sarah has provided consent that she be identifiable in our data and outputs, as have most of the off-camera participants in the workshop. In theory, this is a pretty straightforward recording for us to share as part of the documentation for the project, as it's framed so that Sarah's image and voice are the only truly identifiable elements. Protecting the rights of our partners and participants may well include the decision not to make parts of our data sets accessible, but we also need to check our assumptions before we write off the possibility of sharing some content where participants are identifiable. When it comes to doing participatory research, our partners often want to be named. Anonymity equally may not be possible if our interlocutors are well-known artists in their communities. Protecting, supporting, and collaborating, in other words, can involve making them identifiable in our research outputs. The issue of anonymity is further complicated in the case of intellectual property rights. Creators have the right to be named. This includes the creator of the media file itself, the performer, the composer, and the lyricist, among others. That makes a recording like the one I shared of Sarah Hines quite complicated, and in this case, potentially a reason that we won't be able to make this recording available openly. Well, I created the recording, so that's easy to deal with from a rights perspective. The song she sings, Willow, was released in 2019 on the Lost Words album by Spell Songs, which featured Rachel Newton and Sekou Kaita. The content of the recording, in other words, includes elements with third-party copyrights. In this case, identifying the rights holders was fairly straightforward, but if you're familiar with the folk singing scene in England, you'll know that it's not uncommon to encounter a wide variety of repertoire. It could be in public domain, it could be self-composed, or it could be composed, as in this case, by a living artist. And because folk singers don't always clearly communicate about their intellectual property rights, or indeed whose rights they are using when they perform, it can be difficult to assess who all of the rights holders actually are. Interoperability involves producing data in formats that are standardized and, where possible, open. The types of formats, though, that are common in music research include, among others, scores, audio recordings, video recordings, creative outputs, ephemera related to performances and events, questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups. Within each of these categories exist multiple possible file formats and data standards, complex storage containers that require synchronization to remain useful into the future, and lived realities that mean that the data is created and captured by multiple people with diverse skill sets. For example, well, I might have created this recording of Sarah. Sometimes our partners do the documentation, or in the case of the Heartwood workshop itself, many of the participants are creating similar recordings that they are using to co-create an audiovisual report about their experiences in the workshop. We can give guidance about our preferred formats, but sometimes it's necessary to balance our ideal against what is practical and possible for the individuals generating data. We've attempted to develop processes and guidelines that help us account for the complex legal and ethical issues that surround ethnographic and participatory research, as well as research that involves creative practices. When it comes to generating multimedia data, for example, we work with our partners to build processes that include some of the following elements. We post signage at public events that warns that recording is happening and advising participants of how to ask questions or opt out of being in the recorded materials. We have a public-facing upload policy, which you can access via the QR code on the screen. This covers everything from how to create files, what sorts of information about the file and contents should be shared with us, and what the involved parties' intellectual property rights are. Ultimately, these guidelines are about asking the media creator to either register the media with a Creative Commons license or to assign us copyright when they submit the digital object to us. We have policies around third-party consent. We ask the media creator to obtain verbal consent from anyone included in the media and agree to forward a licensing agreement on our behalf. And then there's simply due diligence. We have an intake policy that records relevant metadata related to rights, ownership, and licensing. You've seen some of the types of metadata we record on the previous 4 slides. These details help to make our data fair. However, in terms of practicalities and workload, we're not clear going forward that it will be feasible to get the identity of all rights holders, especially composers of songs, or to get licenses for all of the recorded material. At the end of the day, we might need to restrict access by not making our data set completely open or by only including short samples of recordings. By providing our partners and their participants with guidelines, we are working towards production of fairer data, but also trying to strike a balance that with sometimes messy circumstances of data collection and the ethics of asking our partners and their participants to undertake extra labor and learning so that they can in turn do their part to support the fairness of the data production. We'd like to conclude by coming back to a few central challenges and questions that working toward fair data continue to raise in the context of our work. So when it comes to being findable, academic discussions of open research prioritize findability by other scholars. How might we work towards making our research visible outside of university networks, though? As researchers, this might involve designing outputs or participating in research outreach activities that are in formats that are prioritized by our partners. At an institutional level, this might mean efforts to build user-friendly interfaces or encourage public access points to repositories like ORDA. Being accessible. Context and creators are often essential to ethnographic research and research that focuses on creative practices. As researchers, we can build options into our consent forms that enable participants to make an informed decision about being identifiable. The templates that are available on the ethics your ethics website do not necessarily need to be followed to the letter. You can work with the team at UREC to make changes that are better suited to your research context. And at an institutional level, obtaining a performing rights online license from the Performing Rights Society for platforms like ORDA would go a long ways towards assisting researchers who are working with music to make their data more accessible. As researchers, we can't license get this type of license, it has to be done at the platform level. But what it would mean is that copyright holders and third-party rights holders, such as composers, would have access to the rights for any content, and it would take care of some of the impossibilities of always identifying every rights holder in a track of music. In terms of interoperability, developing a solid data management plan at the beginning of your project and then distilling it into understandable policies and protocols is a first step to ensuring that the data we produce remains usable into the future. Reusable. Creative Commons licensing is an accessible and easy to understand alternative to common demands on participants to assign the university their intellectual property rights. Using Creative Commons licenses encourage research to be used and developed. The findings from the Ask a Friend report, for example, have recently been expanded upon by the Folk London magazine, reaching a target demographic for us. And while public domain or CC BY may be seen as the gold standard in enabling open research, encouraging use of more restrictive licenses like CC BY NC&D or a share alike license may be more comfortable for our partners and leave them with options in the future for monetizing their IP. And just a final note, good metadata is essential to making our data fair, but producing detailed metadata requires training, subject knowledge, and time. Often the only people who are positioned to provide the types of knowledge that support fairness are our or underpaid partners and participants. Making our data both fair and ethical therefore requires some rethinking of how we distribute research funding and recognize the labor of everyone involved. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Got there in the end. So, hello everyone, good morning. So a lot of what I try and do in SHA is to try and disseminate and communicate research and underpin it also by open practice as well. Try and practice what I do, and I've banged on about this for many years. And one of the issues is how do we actually get research to the right people? I remember running a course. I used to run a day workshop for School of Health and Related Research, which is now the Division of Population Health. That's what we actually are. SHA is the research entity of it. And I remember having a discussion with a senior academic from engineering who actually kind of said, what is the point? Why should we be actually sharing things? Should we just not be publishing it? And I said, well, that's fair enough. But you might as well then just take your research paper, stick it in a bottle, chuck it out to sea, hope it gets picked up. It'll get probably cited. But we work on the premise that people might know how to actually search to find these things and actually have good practice. In SHA, we've got systematic reviewers, we've got information specialists. They focus on searching. We can't rely on other people being as comprehensive and as good a searcher as that. So how do things get cited? There's various reasons why they may get cited and why not. But we're not just talking about citing, we're talking about reaching policymakers, reaching charities, reaching the media, reaching wide-ranging stakeholders. And to kind of give you a spoiler alert, there's no single fix for any of this. There isn't anything. Going on Twitter and sharing something isn't going to get to the right people necessarily, and so forth. So, but I would say, and I wrote a piece for the LSE, I wrote a few April Fool's pieces for the LSE, and one was alternative ways to disseminate your research, and one was to put it in a bottle, chuck it out to sea. If it gets picked up on a far-flung shore, it'll make the news. That's a bit of impact. So maybe it's worth trying. So, you know, we increasingly publish open access, but we also doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's shared. And what we need to do is try and think about open and sharing. And of course, that's often very hard for a lot of academics and PhD students for various reasons. And one of them perhaps being imposter syndrome. Why should anyone want to hear about my work? Why should I put my head above the parapet? There's various concerns and reasons, and we completely and utterly get that. But we now have means to find out perhaps how some things are being shared at the university. We've got Overton, which is a very good tool for discovering whether your research is being picked up in policy. And when we got Overton for the first time a few years ago, I ran searches for colleagues. Said, do you want to see if we've been picked up in policy? And the amount of who said, I don't think I'll have been cited in policy. And you'll go back and go, you've been cited in 10 policy documents. And the buzz that they get from knowing that their work has got somewhere and reached and actually influenced some form of policy. We've also got Altmetric and the Altmetric Explorer, which will show us a lot of ways that things are being disseminated. It doesn't necessarily mean its impact, but it means it's being discussed. It's being discussed in some way. And then there is other tools like BMJ's Impact Analytics, which shows if your research is being picked up and then cited, included in clinical guidelines, which for working in Faculty of Health, that is a great thing to know. That is some form of impact. But in terms of altmetrics, it doesn't tell us everything. And altmetrics are not perfect. No metric is perfect, but they give us an indicator. And I wrote about this for the LSE Impact blog 8 years ago, about how the most important, anyone who's familiar with altmetrics, is the more things, more platforms you get picked up on and shared and discussed, such as news channels, blogs, Wikipedia citations on X, and hopefully increasingly in things like Blue Sky potentially, then a score goes up. People get very, very kind of hung up on metrics and numbers, and it can be quite problematic. And I wrote a piece saying that actually the most important altmetric number is 0. So that does tell you something. It tells you, one, your research is not being picked up by altmetrics. Now, that might be that it's been covered on BBC News, and that's great, and it might have been covered somewhere else that altmetric doesn't cover. But that side, it also means you might be communicating it, but doing it really badly. And I see this often when people will post social media updates. We've published a new paper, blah, blah. Where's the link to the paper? I'm not going to search for that. The media increasingly, they're a huge problem. Local media are terrible, but that's because of the lack of funding. But national media, when they cover stories in such as the Daily Mail, etc., which again, you know, may not like the Daily Mail, but it reaches a lot of people. They don't actually cite the paper they might be talking about. People are not necessarily going to go off and search or know where to find it. So there is that problem, and also the problem that people just may not be communicating it. And again, there's various reasons for that. But of course, we don't have to share everything. I once gave a talk at the British Library many years ago and said we don't have to archive everything, and it was like I got glares from librarians for saying that, but we don't have to share everything. Not everything is shareable. We have to make kind of decisions. I'm getting a glare from a librarian right now for saying it again, but thanks, Kate. But we don't have to share everything. Not everything is worth sharing. We need to think about more about communication. Of course, I think about that more than an awful lot of people. Often where my colleagues start thinking about research communications is after they've published something. They come along and go, I need to do something. I don't know what it is. I've seen that you can do things, maybe make a video. Can we do an infographic? Can we do something? And we have to need to think about actually sharing earlier on in that process. We also need to be very concerned about building pyramids. You know, we don't want somebody to go, oh, look at us, we're doing loads of research communications, we're sharing everything, and we're like absolutely spamming the web. And then someone goes, well, we want a bigger presence than that institute. Let's do this and we'll build a bigger pyramid. And we just flood the internet with more and more stuff. So we have to be very, very careful about pyramid building and just trying to outdo each other. We need to be sharing what's important and thinking about who it is we're trying to get that research to. Because we've made something open access, it's out there, and people would benefit if we told them a bit more about it. But that costs money. And again, another piece I wrote for the LSE a year or so ago about how we should increasingly factor funding into bids to actually help with dissemination. And it's obviously bids, research bids are competitive, money's being squeezed, but if you're putting in for a large bid, say you're putting in for £1 million bid, and you say, right, we're going to put 5% of that across to do some dissemination activities, you know, that's, I mean, what's that, 50 grand? So that's a good bit of money. My maths right? I don't know, but it will actually make, you know, a decent amount of money to spend on those activities because they do cost money. And I increasingly get colleagues coming to me and they say, I want you to do this, can you do this? And we talk about money. And to some extent, I mean, the dean of my school, the School of Health and Medical Research, and the head of the department, the departmental manager, both referred to me in a meeting as the most autonomous role in my department, which is a bit worrying because you worry that that's going to get taken away at some point. But it allows me to basically act as a consultant, to go, yes, I can help you and I can help you. And if you can pay, I can do a bit more for you. And I'm obviously always very busy. And if it gets to the point that I can't keep up with things, let's chat about maybe getting another me to do more of this stuff. So I think that actually paying is a way that we can at least try and actually sort of like change this. So should we factor in money into bids? I think we should. But again, who do we pay for this work? And again, there's issues here. Do we go internally? I believe there's an awful lot we can do internally. And it is better, it skills staff, it gives opportunities to do things differently. And also, we can still go with consultants, but consultants can be very expensive. And I'm part of a project at the moment where we've received a quote for a piece of work. And I was asked by my colleagues that I'm collaborating with in Nottingham and Hallam what I thought about it. I thought the quote was taking the Michael quite a bit. It was £6,000 for what I thought was about £1.5 grand work. So and we could be doing that. But basically, most of what they were offering to do, I can do, and I can do it in probably a day. So, but again, how do we actually value this? You know, how do we actually capture it? Is it impact? You know, we know that impact can be hard to actually sometimes describe, and that impact doesn't happen straight away. But also, like I say, the issue about dissemination comes down to things like confidence. You know, most of my colleagues, when I work with colleagues and get them to do podcasts and do webinars, most of them have imposter syndrome. Yet they're brilliant. They absolutely know what they're talking about. If I was to say, let's go for coffee and we'll sit in Jesseps West and we'll have a coffee and let's talk to me about your work, it'll just come out really fluently and really, really easily, and they'll say loads of really interesting stuff. So we have to get kind of beyond that and try and encourage them. And also, do we need consent to communicate? And sometimes we do. You know, if you're doing stuff for a funder, you may need to go through their communications. That microphone is annoying me. I need to stop flapping my arms. And also, we need support when things go wrong, because obviously reputation is also part of this. Reputation of the university, reputation is yourself as academics and professionals. So we do need that support there as well. Should academics learn to disseminate their own research, open research through blogs and social media and infographics podcasts? Not necessarily. Everyone's very, very busy. And to give them something on top of all the other things they have to do around information governance and ethics and all these other demands, you know, it's very easy for me to come along and go, hey, you all should be on YouTube, or you should be making a TikTok video or whatever. It's very easy to say that. But it's very daunting for people to kind of take that on board and then find the time and the capacity and to actually factor it in. So sometimes they need support. So should they be supported by new roles? And I sort of believe that there's a scope there. And again, something I wrote, sorry, I'm spamming you with LSC Impact blog posts. I write a lot for them. This is something I wrote in 2017, and I'm a strong believer. I sort of was very much embedded with the learning technology community around 10, 15 years ago, and decided I wanted to go and do things in research. And I believe that there is this alternative model to the learning technologies, because learning technologies are incredibly important and useful at this institution, especially right now at the moment, moving stuff from Blackboard over, etc. And they are really, really well thought of. They're a very, very good community and experts. And I don't see a massive difference, really. If you look at the learning technologies, they're driven by pedagogy, whereas like research technologies might be driven by impact, whether it's societal or otherwise. Learning technologists are underpinned by technology such as the VLE, making videos, audio, image creation. If you think about the research technologist, or whatever term they might be, they again are underpinned by technology. That's making blogs, videos, infographics, social media. And so you can see here, most of the things are the same. They've got learning technologists will have familiarization with legislation such as web content and accessibility rules, whereas a research technologist or an open research technologist would understand CC licenses and open research practices and archiving, etc. Again, both evidence-based, both should be agile. A good learning technologist changes constantly and adapts, and someone involved in open research communications has to try and change and adapt And again, understanding different stakeholders, working across different disciplines and departments, being a troubleshooter. I like solving problems. I get all kinds of queries and I like to kind of try and solve them and help people. Try and be a good, strong communicator like a learning technologist. Both are vocational, whereas a learning technologist is business critical, and someone who does the kind of work I do is a luxury. And, you know, I had one line manager who said, as long as you keep doing what you're doing, just keep doing it. As a kind of a veiled threat, you stop doing what you're doing, then we might have to kind of discuss. But hopefully what I keep doing is accepted. And like I say, there are alternatives. External consultants, they will make you really great content, very bespoke dissemination content, help you get it out there. It'll be high quality, but they are very expensive. You know, you want someone comes along and say, I've seen this animation that someone's had made. It's 3 minutes long. Can we make that? I want that animation making by the same people. It's like, well, that's £5,000. That's again a lot of money to make something. They may also not translate your work. And I saw an example of a collaboration between two faculties in this university where they had a website made by an external consultant and it had a .co.uk address. It was not a commercial site. It should be a .ac. It should be registered.ac or worse .org. Archiving is obviously a problem for the people who gave us the quote for this piece of work. They were going to own the work. They were actually going to own and give us some embeddable code. No, we want the thing. We want to be able to give it to our funder and we want to be able to archive it. Because if you own it, every time we want to change it, we've got to go to you and pay you some money to change it and wait for you to change it. So again, problematic. So updating is a problem. And say a piece of work that I'm involved in is this Knowledge for Public Health. It's a collaboration between Hallam, Sheffield and this university. And I'm the research communications lead. And what this is, it's looking at NIHR research. It's a £1 million funded project by the NIHR to mobilise their knowledge. So that's to get their research knowledge into local government. Now, of course, local governments increasingly stretch for cash, but if we can give them knowledge and research that can actually make them have better informed decisions, then that could help them in the long run. So we're also working with members of the public as well as part of this. So it's a big piece of work. And what we actually kind of find is that sometimes, you know, the NHR say, right, we want you to look at something around housing and the impact on health. So we go off and look at the NHS evidence base and go, we've not actually done much research in that. Actually, the research is taking place elsewhere. So it's a question of, is the right research actually being undertaken by the funder to disseminate in the first place? So our plan as this project, it's a 3-year project, hopefully it'll get renewed, is to be open as transparent as possible. We're going to be reflective in our approach. So we've already made a podcast about this. I've got 2 posts ready to go for the LSC on the work that we're doing. Also, one of the things that I did when I spoke to the NIHR, I said, can we have our own NIHR Google accounts? And they said, no one's ever asked for this before. And I said, well, can we have them? Because then we can do all the work within the domain and you own it when we've done. And it's made them rethink, actually, how this is done. They didn't know about Figshare. And I said, well, I want to start archiving our stuff into Figshare. And they were like, okay, right, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And again, they were not aware of this. So we're trying to change their practice. And we've also made it that our website is hosted by Google, created at the University of Sheffield, but it can be passed over to the NIHR because they're a Google institution. So if we don't get the funding in 2.5 years' time or the end of the project, they get the output as well that they can continue with it. We're also doing co-production with a charity called Afruka, which is, I think it's a Manchester-based charity, which works with people from the Black community, people who have suffered domestic violence and abuse. And we're working with members of that community to actually co-produce our communication. So again, we can talk one language, but we're now speaking to people who are actually making us think. And we sit down and we talk to them about, what are your priorities in terms of health inequalities? And they tell us, which is obviously happening across the university increasingly around co-production of research, but also increasingly I'm seeing co-production of communications. And I did a workshop for a project earlier this week for people who have mental health problems. And so again, part of the workshop for me was to help them to disseminate. Now, it's not so straightforward, you know, it can be quite a learning curve for people. But we, you know, doing all this has the potential to improve the impact of the work. And there are lots of challenges and barriers, but I think we will potentially see some good rewards. Here is our actual note. It's not got many things at the moment. It's got the protocol in there. It's got a video in there, an infographic, etc. But we are putting things into a no pH collection, which has been set up with an NIHR email address. So again, at the end of the project, it's theirs. We don't have to take anything out and dump it. We can give them the details, and they've got that archive. So it's a work in progress. Trying to host content on sustainable discovery platforms if we can. We're trying to produce outputs that are CC licensed and trying to make them accessible. That's something we need to think a lot more about. And this is where learning technologists are a little bit better, thinking about accessibility. Because again, trying to reach the right people. Some of these people may have accessibility issues. So we are learning all the time. So really trying to do communications differently. We shouldn't stop thinking about communications happen after something's been published open access. We need to think about it more as a kind of an endemic continual process. Also looking at things like awareness days, trying to tag on to things. I'm trying to get a public engagement event going. I've got some colleagues together to do something on the gut-brain connection. I've got colleagues from mental health and from nutrition, because it so happens in November there's a health and well-being festival week, and the actual theme is mind and body. So it's like, right, we've got people who know this stuff. Let's try and tag on to this to do something for that. And again, trying to get the money for that, I have to beg, borrow, steal, and but I'm never afraid to go and ask people. And don't be afraid to tell people about your work. And I do believe the medium is the message, that sometimes by doing communications in a certain way that might be eye-catching, it might be seen as a bit novel or a little bit kind of catchy, but what you're doing is you're trying to get them in to see that work, to start that conversation. And also networks are very crucial about this. So am I back?
Yeah, thank you, perfect timing.